The seed is the word of God. Christ is the sower. All who come to him will live forever. Alleluia. 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 The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. On that day, Jesus went out of the house and sat down by the sea. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat down. And the whole crowd stood along the shore. And he spoke to them at length in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground where it had little soil. It sprang up at once because the soil was not deep. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and it withered for lack of roots. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it. But some seed fell on rich soil and produced fruit, 100 or 60 or 30-fold. Whoever has ears ought to hear. The Gospel of the Lord. This morning, we can celebrate that the Washers are back from the dead and back with us. They were suffering from illness for a while, so it's good to have them back with us. And just in time for Mark's favorite prophet, the prophet Jeremiah, right? Jeremiah is one of the most famous prophets of the Old Testament. It's the longest prophetic book of the Old Testament. Jeremiah, I think, in my opinion, is probably the most accessible prophet. If you're looking for a book to start reading of the Old Testament prophets that's going to be easy enough to read and follow, Jeremiah is the best one. It's largely written as a narrative about the life of Jeremiah with prophecies mixed in. And a lot of the prophetic books of the Old Testament, it's just large sections of just straight prophecy. Jeremiah is largely a biography about Jeremiah, right? An autobiography, right? And then filled in with some prophecies. Jeremiah is also very special in the Old Testament because he is a sign of God's command for celibacy, right, in the mystery of salvation history. One of the things that many people think is that celibacy was something that came in the New Testament, right, with the church. But actually, all throughout the Scriptures, there are examples of celibacy. I wonder if you can think of any other people who are celibate in the Scriptures. Now, you might think in the New Testament, you might think of Jesus, obviously, or St. John, or St. Paul, right? Even before he had his great conversion, right, he was already living a celibate vocation, right? And then in the Old Testament, you have people like Elijah and Elisha who were celibate. Jeremiah was a celibate prophet. Ezekiel was commanded by God not to marry after his wife died, right? So a kind of late vocation to celibacy. And we also know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the Qumran community, right, living a couple of centuries before the time of Jesus, we know that they were essentially a community of celibate Jewish monastic kind of men. Right? So celibacy was not something that was invented by the church later on. There's a couple of reasons for celibacy. The primary reason why Jeremiah was celibate is because of the danger of his mission. Right? Jeremiah suffered a lot in his life, and he stood up to the various rulers of his day. Right? And so God did not want him to feel any pressure from his family, right, to renounce his mission. Right? And so he was called to celibacy. Celibacy, in many ways, is a call to the cross, and a call to sacrifice, and a call to suffering. And so Jeremiah is a very interesting prophet, and we're going to be hearing about him a lot in the next few weeks. Something I think that is just very striking, a couple of things about the reading we heard from today. We heard about the very call of Jeremiah, right? God says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I dedicated you. This is not just for Jeremiah. This is something for all of us. It's important that all of us recognize that when God created us, right, he had no need for us. He created us for a specific purpose. Fulton Sheen famously said that whenever a child is conceived in the womb, God also makes a crown for them in heaven, right, preparing them. Right? God has a specific purpose and mission for all of us. Right? And in the sacrament of confirmation in particular, that is the sacrament which sends us on mission. It's so sad that in so many different confirmation ceremonies in the church, right, people get confirmed and it's like nothing changes, right? We should feel the fire coming down in our churches when we receive the sacrament of confirmation and be sent out in power. So I love the imagery of Jeremiah, right? He says, Lord, I'm too young. I don't know how to speak. Right? And God, in a similar way to the prophet Isaiah, right? And the same way with Moses. Remember Moses, when he was called, he likewise did the same thing. I'm not worthy. I'm not a good speaker, right? And God called him anyway. And remember with the prophet Isaiah said, I am a man of unclean lips from a land of unclean people. And what did God do? Right? From the altar in heaven, right? An angel placed a coal in Isaiah's mouth, right? Making him worthy, right? And in a similar way, God does that to Jeremiah here too, right? The Lord extended his hand and he touched Jeremiah's mouth, right? Again, it's that beautiful imagery that should definitely remind us of the Mass, that we come here as unworthy servants, completely unworthy of anything God has to give us. And yet we receive the Lord of the universe and we are sent out. Right? No Christian, when they're out preaching and evangelizing, should ever be prideful. Right? It should always be very clear to them and how unworthy they are. And the only reason they are evangelizing at all is because Christ has chosen us to make us worthy. I also love the imagery, what God says to Jeremiah, basically a foreshadowing of his ministry. For many years, Jeremiah would be prophesying in Jerusalem, for over 50 years, in fact. And the Lord tells him, see, I place my words in your mouth. This day I set you over nations and over kingdoms, to root up and to tear down, to destroy and demolish and build and plant. Right? All just with the power of Jeremiah's mouth. Right? That's something that we don't often reflect on enough as Christians, is the power of our words and the power of speech. One of the things I tell young people when I'm talking to them about the power of words, I bring up Winston Churchill, right, for so much of World War II, basically keeping England in the fight. And how? Just simply with his voice over the radio. Our words and our mind carries great power. And I think too often, modern day Christians, right, we're too afraid to speak. Right? We neglect this most powerful tool that we have. Jeremiah, just by the words of his mouth, rooted up and tore down nations and institutions. And we can do the same. And the irony, right, in our modern culture is actually people on the opposite side of the aisle, right, are tending to do the very opposite. Right? We now have this phenomenon of political correctness. I've actually been reading a book about this recently, right? And the author makes the point that basically political correctness is a tool of wicked and evil people, right? To silence people on the other side of politics or of culture. Right? We wonder, why is Christianity losing so much ground in the wider culture? It's because we tend to be so afraid of getting in trouble or causing offense or making people angry or sad, right? We need to be more courageous and strong and recognize that when we come to Mass, when we come to confession, when we receive the sacraments, right, God empowers us to speak his word in the culture. The very virtue of faith, right? One way to describe the virtue of faith is learning how to see all things with the mind of Christ and to be able to speak that to the world. To be a prophet is not so much to foretell the future as much as it is to be God's mouthpiece in the world, speaking God's very words to the people around us. That is ultimately what it means to be a prophet. But if we do that, obviously there's going to be consequences. And we have to be willing to accept that as Christians. And we're going to see that Jeremiah, all throughout his life, courageously, despite the consequences, continued to speak and to be God's mouthpiece to the people. In the midst of lots of different false prophets, he spoke the truth.